morning, everyone. Welcome to our third and final morning of the 2015 Dalton Institute. How's everyone doing? Well, my name is Matt Dishman. I'm a first-year grad here in the FSU program, and it is my honor to welcome our last keynote speaker of the weekend. Dr. Andrew Seligsohn received his bachelor's degree from Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. He went on to achieve a PhD at the University of Minnesota, and from 2001 to 2007, he served as faculty in the Department of Political Science at Hertwick College. During that time, he earned tenure and became the rank of associate professor. Andrew went on to become the director of civic engagement, learning at Princeton University, and later served as associate director for civic engagement and strategic planning at Rutgers University, Camden. He advocated for underrepresented students through creating the Hills Family Center for College Access and Rutgers Future Scholars Program. Both programs provide support to first-generation students as they prepare for, apply to, and embark on post-secondary opportunities. In June of 2014, Dr. Seligsohn became the 5th president of Campus Compact. At this time, the avid Yankee fan had to cross enemy lines and live amongst the Boston Red Sox. Located in Boston, Campus Compact is the only national higher education association solely dedicated to campus-based civic engagement. Campus Compact is dedicated to promoting public and community service. So please join me in welcoming the man who provides leadership to such an influential organization, Dr. Andrew Seligsohn.
Good morning. Good morning. I want to thank Matt for that kind introduction and for generously hosting me as I've been down here in Tallahassee. I want to thank as well Dr. Mary Coburn and Dr. Brandon Bowden for inviting me to participate in this event, which I've been following it on Twitter before I've been coming down here. I've been using Twitter for 2 weeks, so it's still very exciting to me. So it's like, wow, I can learn about what's going on down there before I get down there. I also want to give a little shout out to our friends from Florida Campus Compact, Dee Dee Rasmussen, and Mike and Karen are here, our tremendous colleagues who do great work in this state, here with FSU and all around the state of Florida, and are real exemplars nationally for what this work can look like and what an impact campus engagement can have both for students and for communities. So what I want to do is start by talking a little bit about a place that Matt just mentioned, Camden, New Jersey, where I was working until about 6 months ago. And when I started at Camden, so I'd come down as Associate Chancellor for Civic Engagement, and my charge really was to begin to build a campus-wide infrastructure that would enable the campus to have an impact, a positive impact on a city that is almost always ranked as among the poorest and most dangerous cities in the United States of America. There was a campus of a great state university sitting right in the middle of that city, and the chancellor wanted that campus to be a part of making positive change in the city for residents. And he essentially said to me, figure out how to do that, and together we'll make that happen. And when I first started, I began by trying to get to know everybody I could. So people on the campus, people off the campus. I went out and found who are leaders in this community, pastors, leaders of community-based organizations, just residents that other people told me were influential and could bring along their neighbors. And I wanted to learn about what did they care about, what did they want to achieve, what did they hope to see the university do, what were their concerns about the university getting involved, how could we work together to make change, to improve conditions for education, for health, for public safety, for the things that matter to people, for economic development, which is a huge issue there. And so I found myself sitting down one day with a guy named Rod Sadler, who is a community organizer. He's probably in his late 60s. He works in a neighborhood called North Camden where he lives. He's an African-American man who grew up in Philly and moved to Camden to open a boatyard about 30 or 40 years ago. And he got involved as an organizer when his neighborhood was threatened with a prison being built right in the middle of it, right on prime waterfront property that looked right across the river at the beautiful skyline of Philadelphia. And it was about to be turned into a prison, cutting off neighborhood access to the river and creating a kind of drag on a neighborhood that was trying to lift itself up. And that was in the mid-1980s. The neighborhood lost that fight. The prison was built. But the neighborhood organization lived on and continued to fight for better conditions and better treatment of their neighborhood. And by the time I arrived, things had been reversed because they had just succeeded in persuading the state to take the prison down and to reopen the access to the river. And so there was a kind of a moment of kind of brightness and possibility. And so Rod was interested in hearing how the university might participate in that. And he wanted to learn a little bit about what I thought of all that. But what I discovered really quickly was he also wanted to learn a lot about me. So like any good community organizer, he asked me a ton of questions, and he tried to get a sense of who I was. And I had the sense, as we were talking, that Rod was probing a little bit, looking for something, but I didn't know what. And at a certain point in the conversation, I happened to mention that my mother had worked for decades, and even though she pretends she retired, she continues to work, as an advocate for fair housing, fighting housing discrimination, mostly in the county where I came from in New York State, and now in Boston, where she's, again, pretending to be retired. And when I said that that was the work my mother did, Rod said, "Oh, okay." And I said, what was that about? Like, what was that? What was that the answer to? And he said, I look at you. You are a white guy who grew up in the suburbs. You have a PhD. You were working at Princeton University, and I want to know, why did you come down here? Why did you choose to work in this city, in this place? That's what a lot of Camden looks like. And it's still true today, although I think there's a lot of evidence that things are moving in a positive direction. And Rod wanted to know what I was doing there. And for him, the answer to the question became clear once he understood where I had developed my values. So when he understood the work my mother had been doing, that she'd been fighting for equal treatment for people across racial lines, across lines of ability and disability, sexual orientation, family status, it made sense to him, and it seemed to be the case to him that I might be somebody he could work with. That's what he needed to know. I knew that I was there because I had a sense of what this could look like, right? So for me, that's an image of students involved, international students at Rutgers Camden working in an after-school program we built together with the 3 schools in the adjacent neighborhood, working with kids in the city of Camden. I knew that we had the potential to get our students to begin to think creatively about how they could make change. So in the context of that partnership, one of our students developed an ESL program to offer to recent immigrant families the opportunity to develop English language skills that they wanted so that they could go out effectively and seek jobs in the job market. That's what was drawing me there. But Rod had the sense that if I was to be doing this work in a real way, it must be because there were some exemplars in my life who had set the table for me and had shaped me in some way that would lead me toward this work. And so this is what I want to talk about today, is the role of example setting and of examples in developing student values. And in particular, I want to talk about, even though I'll start, so I told one story and I'm going to tell you another in a minute. I'm going to start with some stories that are about people at the individual level. But what I really want to get to is thinking about how colleges and universities create examples, become examples, are themselves examples for students, and the role that has in shaping the values of college students, their commitments to equity, to justice, and to living lives that realize the values that we all talk about all the time. So this is my agenda. I told story 1, that was the one about Rod Sadler when I arrived. I'm about to tell story 2, which I'll tell in just a moment. Then I'm going to derive some implications of those stories. So what do I think they mean and reveal about the way examples work in shaping our values, our commitments, our willingness and capacity to do this work. I'm going to float the hypothesis on the role of universities in shaping the values of college students, and then I'll test the hypothesis. So I'll bring out some empirical evidence. So a little storytelling, but then we'll move into some good old-fashioned empirical data about what we know about how this might work. And then I'll talk about some implications for action. So if I'm right in the hypothesis that I'm going to propose, that I'm going to give some evidence supporting, what does it mean for those of us who are university leaders, for those of us who are students, for faculty, for staff? What does it mean for all of us in our various roles on campuses? So that's where I'm headed. And the one thing I want to say, obviously the theme of this gathering has been a focus on inequality and the struggle, the work to try to achieve equity and justice through the work we do with students. And for me, in some ways, I won't be talking directly about that all that much, but that is the background of all of this for me. So as all of you know, and you've probably heard some about during this conference, we live in an age of exploding economic inequality, right? So for the last 40 years, a lot of work that had been done over the previous 40 to create greater equality and shared prosperity in this country, that has been eroded in significant ways and in accelerating ways. And it's created enormous differences in wealth, differences in access to education, and to all sorts of other important goods like healthcare, like safe neighborhoods, all those things. We've seen a resegregation along lines of race in many parts of this country, especially in northern cities where there's been a sorting out by class that has then become embedded also in categories of race so that we live more separately. Our colleges and universities reflect this, right? Students from low-income families find it less and less possible to access the highest quality institutions in this country and find themselves more and more segregated into institutions that are resource challenged and cannot provide the same opportunities as other institutions. So it's inside higher education, not just outside of it. And this is the thing maybe that concerns me the most, it has become embedded in our political processes, right? So we all, I think, living in a market economy, etc., we accept the idea that some people are going to have more than others, people choose different jobs, some people start companies, etc. But we also believe in a principle of equal opportunity to influence the political process. The notion that all of us are created equal is in fact the bedrock principle of our political system. And democracy is supposed to be the idea that your voice counts equally regardless of your wealth. But we know that's not true. If you don't have access to good education, the opportunity to influence the political process is diminished. If you don't have the resources to get your voice out there, your access to political influence is diminished. And then we've seen that embedded in things like, all of you are probably familiar with the Citizens United decision, with different ways that our voting systems have been influenced in recent years. So there's a deep possibility that these economic inequalities get embedded in political processes, which mean that the people who are losing out economically also don't have an opportunity to try to change public policy. And that becomes a kind of problem that is then so deeply embedded it's very difficult to undo. So for me, higher education as one of our most important social institutions has a role to play in all this, and that's why, for me, this matters to talk about. So again, I mostly won't be talking about that, but that's the background reality against which all of this takes place. Okay, we roll forward. So this is the second story. And this story, by the way, first requires me to step back about 35 years and then another 40. So I'll ask you to hang with me a little bit, and I'll try to make this reasonably clear. So this is another story about me. I'm talking a little bit about myself this morning. I apologize for that. And this is a story about when I was 11 years old in 1979. I went with my father for a kayaking trip on the Delaware River along the border between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So we spent about 4 days in a boat just like that with all our gear. We camped by the side of the river. It was great. This was like one of the funnest things for an 11-year-old kid. My other 3 siblings were off doing whatever they were doing in that summer, and we just did this kind of father-son trip, and it was marvelous. And it was in this terrifically beautiful place. I promote the Delaware River to anybody who's looking for a lovely place to go kayaking or anything else. And so what we did was, from where I grew up in New York, we drove a few hours and we went to an outfitter from whom we rented the kayak and the gear. And this was, way before the internet, so we sat there looking at physical maps. These are pieces of paper with indications of what geography looks like. And, the guy kind of at the outfitter, he helped us do all this, and then we loaded all the gear onto his truck, and he drove us 60 miles up the river. put us in, and we were going to paddle down and see him 4 days later. And the guy was clearly German. He was an immigrant from Germany. He had a distinct accent. And what this made me think of as an 11-year-old was what I knew about our family. So my father was born in Berlin in 1926 in a Jewish family. So when he was 6 years old, Nazis came to power, and his childhood was shaped by that experience, by living as a Jewish child in a Nazi-controlled place. I might have just, oh, there are software updates available. Let's see. Here we go. It's looking good here.
It's back.
All right, we're back in business. So, my father, that was his childhood, going to school in segregated schools, being forced to endure various sorts of humiliation, the fear of a degree, of increasing violence against Jews going on. Ultimately, he and his mother and sister fled to the United States. When he was about 13, they left. But his father stayed, and he ended up in a concentration camp, and he died in that camp. So we're here with this German guy who's older than my father. I didn't know exactly how old he was, but I could tell that he was old enough that he might have been involved in all that in some way. And I couldn't understand why my father was conducting himself in this friendly, congenial way with this guy. My father still spoke German, and so they spoke a little German together, then they switched back to English so that I wouldn't be excluded. But they just chatted in a friendly way for the few hours we spent together between getting all the equipment together, driving the 60 miles, whatever. And I really could not understand this. And I remember sort of, as we were getting on the river and starting paddling, I was kind of thinking about this, and it didn't make sense to me, and it wasn't what I'd seen from a lot of other people. So a lot of my Jewish friends growing up, their parents and grandparents were openly hostile toward Germans, and I couldn't have imagined them behaving in this way. And I didn't ask my father about it. I knew he didn't like to talk about that time in his life, and so I just kind of stewed with it, whatever. And the first time I spoke about that with him was actually 17 years later, in 1996. It was over the holidays, we were together with a lot of people, and somehow this topic, because by then I'd seen him act in this way with Germans many times. So I knew this was his approach. And over time, I came to understand it, but it finally came up, and I told him that particular experience had stuck in my mind from that kayaking trip. That was one of the things that really stood out. And he started to talk about it. And so what he said was, he took me back to a night in 1938, so when he was 12 years old, and this was him as a child, so about that age, I think. And he brought up an event that some of you are probably quite familiar with called Kristallnacht. So this was a night in 1938 when Nazi soldiers and kind of associated thugs kind of tore through Germany and Austria, destroying the businesses of Jews, homes of Jews, synagogues were, all the windows were smashed, buildings were torched, etc. This was a New York Times headline from right afterward, and this is what it looked like on the streets of just about all the cities across Germany and Austria. So he was 12. His father, who was a prominent lawyer, was out of the country on business. He was in the Netherlands. And my father said the phone started ringing. And a lot of the calls were from friends from their synagogue, members of the Jewish community, just checking in on each other, making sure everybody was okay. But my father said a lot of the calls they got were actually from non-Jews, from my grandfather's clients, many of whom were Christian, who were worried, were offering help, wanted to know if the family was okay. And doing that, even in 1938, it was already clear that there was tremendous risk in that for people. That if you were seen as helping Jews, as opposing the regime, you were putting yourself and your family at risk. And so my father said to me, I knew that many Germans were actively supportive of the Nazis, that many were indifferent to the fate of Jews, but he said, I also knew that some people were reaching out and helping, and when I meet somebody who is German from that generation, if I don't know differently, I have to assume they were in that latter group. I have to treat them as if they were somebody who did the right thing. And again, by the time we had this conversation, I implicitly understood that was exactly what he thought, and that was the way he conducted himself. At great difficulty, I'm sure. but that was the first time he had spelled it out for me. And it was a part of who he was. So this is a picture of him from his college yearbook. One of the things that he was proudest of in his life was that at Haverford College, where he was a student, class of 1950, that he had been part of a group that had drafted a major revision to the honor code that governed student life at Haverford. There was a system of basically student self-regulation, and he saw that as a tremendously valuable thing. And again, through all the things he did in his life, that was one of the things that stood out to him, the opportunity to work with others, to craft a system of shared values that would be collectively enforced to maintain high ethical standards within a community. So that's story number 2, and so I want to say a little bit about what I see as the implications of those stories. The first one is that the examples we have in our lives matter an enormous amount for the development of values. So again, by the time I had the conversation where my father actually articulated what his reasoning was, I didn't know that he specifically linked it with that particular night, but I understood where he was coming from. And of course, my own values had been shaped profoundly by the example he set in my life. And again, I think this makes sense to all of us, right? We know that important, influential people in our lives matter to the kinds of people we become. Seeing examples, watching them in action. And so that's the second point, is that actions matter independent of words. So the things we say to each other matter, but the things we witness other people doing, those things matter an enormous amount, even before we ever hear explanations for those things. And then the third thing is this idea that understanding through application precedes principles. And here's what I mean by that. I watched my father doing this over and over again. And then I started doing it myself, right? Trying to do it as best I could myself. Never having the challenge that he did, but knowing that this is the way we treat people, right? On the assumption that they, like us, are trying to do their best, and that we reach out to them on that basis, and that we do our best to work together, knowing that we fail, etc. I started doing that before I could articulate a principle that would support that, or reasoning that would require that in every case. So we watch, we imitate, we try, we get some subtle correction from people in our lives, and we ultimately develop the capacity to do this even before we're really good at talking about it. And this idea is not one that I developed, so that's Aristotle up there. And probably other people had already thought of it. He's one of the first people to kind of write it down. And he asked the question, how do we become ethical? And he said there's 3 possibilities that he could come up with: by nature, by reason, or by habituation. So nature would be you're just born that way. And he didn't think that was very likely because he thought it would be kind of random, and he didn't think the world was set up that way. So he said, well, maybe it's by reason. You learn, you derive principles. And he said what he had actually observed was that people who couldn't give a really good account of the principles still acted ethically. And in fact, most people couldn't learn the principles unless they already knew how to act ethically. That you couldn't even really engage in very thoughtful reasoning about ethics unless you yourself were pretty good at acting ethically already. So he thought, actually, it's probably habituation. And he thought it was through the influence of people like parents to children. He talked about legislators to citizens, so he thought government played this role in political communities, that by acting well yourself, and by, again, giving subtle guidance and correction when, as a parent, you see your child not acting well, or as a teacher, your student not acting well, that people become subtly habituated to acting ethically. They get into the habit, and then they are in a position to think through, why is it that that's the right thing to do? How can I make sense of this in a principled way that I can then apply in future and perhaps more complex situations? And again, I think there's now lots of psychological evidence about these processes that supports this, but again, I think it's kind of deeply consistent with our intuitions about how this works. Okay, so let's say that this is right, that the way we become the people we are over time is by having the influential individuals, and as I said, Aristotle talked not only about individuals, but institutions, having individuals and institutions helping us to become habituated to acting in ways that reflect both ethics at the individual level, but also justice more broadly. And for Aristotle, just to kind of fill this out a little bit, ethics he talked about as being a political science. So we think, we've got a philosophy department where they teach ethics, and then we have a political science department where they teach something else. He thought that ethics was a political science. Meaning, so if politics, which it was for Aristotle, means the ways that we interact in a community, that's politics. He called us, right, the zoon politikon, the political animal, and what he meant by that was that we are an animal that lives in communities. The word politikon comes from the Greek polis, which means city. So the life of a city, the life of a community, that is politics. And he thought the way that you could have justice in a city was for people to act ethically, right? So if we act ethically individually, and then we come up with ways to structure our shared action such that it's characterized by ethics, that will be a just city. That will be a just political community. So that's what we're talking about, is shaping people ethically so that we can have just societies, just communities. If it's right that's how this works, that the role of the examples in our lives at the individual and collective level, then we would think that it might matter how colleges and universities act, right? That the ways that colleges and universities conduct themselves might matter a lot for the students who come to them precisely to learn, to develop, to change. So this is the hypothesis, which is, oh wait, so let's see, is this going to work? Yes. For some reason on the little image over here, it wasn't showing up right. There it is. So the hypothesis, the degree to which universities demonstrate commitment to public goods will affect the degree to which students develop positive civic values. So that's the hypothesis. And let me say a little bit what I mean by that. Sometimes we think about universities in the context of student civic values in terms of what are the programs we create for students, how do we give students the opportunity to learn, etc. That stuff I suspect is really important. In fact, we have a lot of evidence that it is, and I think you've heard some of that evidence over the last couple of days. But I'm suggesting something that goes a little bit further, that it might also matter how universities conduct themselves more broadly. That students will pay attention not just to the things we frame that are for students, but that when universities are acting in the world, in all the different ways universities act, right? As purchasers of products, as employers of people, as real estate developers, in all these ways, and others, right? As interactors with media in broad ways. And we can list a whole bunch of things that colleges and universities are and do, that maybe all that stuff matters to the ways students experience those institutions and ultimately to the degree to which students develop the values that we care about here, the values that make it possible for us to live justly in communities. So that's the hypothesis. So now I want to test the hypothesis, and we tend to do that by looking at, what sources of evidence do we have on this question. And I want to say, in the literature, so my understanding is that Alexander Aston kind of gave you a kind of really robust walk through the literature on service learning and university engagement, which is terrific. So in this literature, there's a lot of evidence that experiences, which I think of as engaged civic learning, experiential opportunities for students that connect them with their communities, whether through service or through joint action or something else, that this has a big impact on student self-understandings, on their commitment to do civic work, on their identities as members of communities. And I think we know from other research, some of which is ongoing. There's a group that Tania Mitchell is kind of leading from the University of Minnesota that's looking at how engaging in this work shapes students' career choices. And we know that, in fact, it does in significant ways. So we know that stuff is high impact. And in that literature, there's also some significant attention to partnerships and the quality of partnerships. And again, this goes back in this literature a pretty long way. So many of you are probably familiar with the work of Eiler and Giles. There's a classic book called Where is the Learning in Service Learning? And one of their findings is that the quality of the partnerships that we frame has an impact on student learning. And I think most of the time people have interpreted that in one way, which is to say, if you have a really good partnership in which the student work is situated, then you will develop experiences that are of high quality. You'll have good communication between the faculty member and the community partner. You will be in a position really to do something that's of high quality. I'm absolutely certain that is true, and that's part of the story. I think there's something else, though, that's possible, and this is one of the things we'll look into, which is maybe it's also the case that the partnership is an example to students, right? That seeing faculty members engaging in respectful, collaborative ways with community partners is part of the story, that students are experiencing that, and that that's shaping their own sense of how you work with community, how you work in community, how you pursue change, how you interact across difference, because very often partnerships between communities and universities involve differences in status, in sometimes across class, sometimes across race. All of these things may be built into that. If students are seeing a powerful partnership that reflects that kind of mutual shared respect and concern, maybe that's part of the story. So I was helped in thinking this through by some data gathered through the PSRI, the Personal and Social Responsibility Inventory, which I'll give you the URL a little bit later. Many of you may be familiar with this. This is a survey that's now administered at about, I'll say dozens of universities with tens of thousands of students. It's housed at Iowa State University. And the folks there, both Bob Reason, who kind of oversees it, and Kevin Hemer, who I understand is an FSU alum from a program that I think many of you are part of. Bob and Kevin together did a little data analysis and sent me some materials because we'd gotten in a conversation about this when I'd heard Bob talk a little bit about some of this work. So the first couple pieces of data I want to show you are students responding to a question, or two questions. One is, what do you think is your your institution's level of commitment to public values, and what do you think should be your institution's level of commitment to those values? And what they found, and the values that are listed in this the particular graph you're seeing, I'm trying to see how large it is. So on the bar on the far left, it's about the value of contributing to a larger community. The middle bar, it's about the valuing taking other perspectives seriously. And the third one is just the importance of ethical and moral reasoning in guiding your action. And the basic answer is many students believe that their institutions should take these things seriously, and fewer students think that their institutions do take this seriously. So the red bars are the should, and the blue bars are the do take it seriously. So this data is from first-year students, and then this data is from seniors. And you might notice that the gap grows. So the longer students are at their institutions, the less they believe that institutions are living up to the values they should. And this, I don't know if you can see the table too well, but this just shows that relationship. So over time, if you look at the right sort of most column, the students who think that an institution should care about these things, that increases from freshman year to senior year by about 4 to 5% in the three different categories. But the question of is it a major focus stays completely flat. So no more students are persuaded that the institution cares about this when they're walking out the door than during their first year, but more of them think that the institution should care about this. So they experience a gap at the beginning, and the gap grows during their time in college. So that's one piece of data. Okay. This looks at the next set of graphs we're looking at, and again, I'm just taking a look to see how it might look to you, is comparing students who are taking part in service learning and those who are not taking part in service learning on these three issues. So again, on the left, it's how important is contributing, or is this a major focus of the institution or not, for contributing to a larger community, perspective taking, and then ethical and moral reasoning. And again, the is and the, so let me just explain how these work. The blue bars are, it is a major focus of this institution, that's students who participated in service learning, and the green is those who didn't. So in other words, what you can see as you look across, service learning students actually think it is a focus of the institution more than those who didn't participate, and that's true across the board. And then the red and the yellow are the should be a focus of the institution for service learning and non-service learning. And again, the service learning students think it should be at even higher levels. So there's still a gap between the service learning and the non-service learning students. It's just the whole thing is shifted up. So all students agree that it should be a focus much more than it really is. But it's just that sort of both feelings are intensified among students who participated in service learning. And the same thing is true if you look at, and I'm not showing you the data, but the graphs for students who've participated in courses that involve a focus on diversity, those graphs look essentially the same. And it's also true for students who've participated in community service outside of the classroom. The graph looks essentially the same. So, what do we know so far? We know that in terms of student perceptions, there's a gap between what is and what ought to be, right? Students believe that institutions should care about contributing to the public good. They should care about fostering a world in which people can understand and respect and sympathize with different perspectives, that they should care about diversity, etc. But they don't believe that their institutions are doing it at anything like the level that they ought to. And again, this is about, think about your institution overall. It's not about, what about this class, did they create a good class for you? It's saying, does your university as an entity in the world live up to the values that you think it ought to? And students consistently are saying no. And again, they think so a little bit more if they've participated in certain kinds of experiences that are focused in that direction, but their expectations rise as well. So they still feel that their expectations for what the institution ought to do, those expectations are not being met by the actions they observe from their institutions. So, there's the gap, as we said, it grows over students' time at college. So in some ways, right, if the better somebody knows you, the less they think of you, that would raise some flags, right? And that's kind of what we have here. We know that participation in these activities, what we think of as high-impact activities, increase both the perceived importance of this, so that's good, right? We would hope that students who participated in service learning or courses focused on diversity would care more about these issues, and they do, but then they're in a way even more disappointed, even though they think a little better of their institutions, but there's still this significant gap on something they now care more about. The last piece is not part of what I've already showed you, and that is this, that there is a strong correlation between students' perceptions of commitment, that is to say, perceptions of the institution's commitment, and their own development on the categories that are measured on this inventory. So in other words, within the inventory, there's indices that measure things like student development in the importance of contributing and the degree to which they expect to contribute in their own lives. There's measures of the degree to which students have developed in their own taking seriously of the perspective of others, and there are measures of development in students' capacity to think through and apply ethical reasoning in the context of ethical dilemmas. So it turns out that there is a strong positive correlation between students thinking that their institutions are doing the right thing in these areas and their own development. In other words, if students believe that their institutions are in fact acting in ways that are consistent with their own principles, students themselves make more progress in their own development along these dimensions, right? So putting these things together, students are paying attention, they care, they have high expectations for their campuses, those expectations are being frustrated in what they perceive. These institutions are not living up to it. High-impact practices are shifting this around, but they don't change that relationship. Students are still, in some ways, disappointed in their institutions. And now we know that has an impact, and the correlations are very strong. So a very strong correlation between the extent to which you think the institution is doing the right thing and your own self-reported changes in terms of the degree to which you are a person who is ethically reasoning, you are a person who's committed to social justice, perspective taking in a way that reflects respect for diversity, etc. So what our institutions are doing matters in terms of the impact on students, and it seems students do not feel that the institutions are doing enough to live up to these values. So now, the one thing I should say about this data is all of this is self-reported, right? And that is one of the issues that is a huge challenge in this field of research. How do you measure whether a student has really changed ethically over time, right? It's a very difficult thing to do. So what we often turn back on is we ask students, how important are these things to you? How much do you care about making positive change in the world, about treating others respectfully, etc. So that's a limitation because, I don't know, maybe we aren't so good at analyzing how ethical we really are or how committed we really are. That could be a problem. And as I said, that affects this whole field of research. Still, right, if you ask people how committed are you, and it turns out that they're more likely to say they're committed if they think their institution is committed, that still seems like something that we should care about, even though we know that it's not an external objective measure of how ethical they are, right? They still are relating their own commitment to these values to the extent to which they see these values realized in their institutions. And again, I don't think any of this should be that shocking to us, right? If you are sitting in courses that are framed by an institution that you know are directed toward trying to make you a more ethical person, but you believe that the institution that put that whole situation together is itself not really enacting those values, I think we would expect that to generate a certain level of cynicism, right? Why should I be someone who takes seriously these ethical principles? Why should I do something that's actually quite difficult in life, right? To sometimes deny ourselves things we might want because we think that it wouldn't be just for us to have them, or reach out to people where the interactions might be uncomfortable because we come from very different worlds and I might be challenged. Why should I do all that if I don't even think the folks who are trying to make me do it or cause me to want to do it themselves really care about it that much, right? So again, I don't think there's any terrific surprises in terms of our intuition, but this is a little bit of data that suggests that this is a real relationship, that students are paying attention and that the way they're paying attention may not be having the impact that we would want over time. So as I said, I wanted to, if you're interested in digging into this data, I've got the URL right there for the personal and social, oh, in fact, I typoed that. So I'm telling you that right now, if anybody's writing this down, it's PSRI. I flipped the letter. So it's the Personal and Social Responsibility Index. If you Google that, you'll find them. And again, a huge thanks to Bob Reason and Kevin Heeman for helping me with this work. Okay, so that was testing the hypothesis, right? So the hypothesis again was that the way our institutions act in the world will have an impact on students' development of civic values. And again, that includes things like commitment to equity and commitment to act in ways that are based on principles of justice, etc. And at least we found some support for that in this data. So there's some reason to think that that hypothesis is probably right. So I want to now talk a little bit about what do we do about that, right? So this is all very interesting, and I think of myself as a scholar practitioner. So as Matt said, I have a kind of standard academic background. I'm a political scientist. I talk political science. I've done research in that area, and that's all important, and I value that, and it matters a lot, and it's at the core of our institutions. But I found myself in my own work wanting more and more to be connecting that thinking with action in the world, right? So I got involved in that through universities, and that's really what I'm doing at Campus Compact, is trying to enable that work to take place. So I'm interested in thinking about, okay, maybe we've learned something interesting this morning, I hope so. What do we do about it? What are the things we can do? So there are a number of things that we can do, depending on our roles. So for university leaders, the first thing I think is we can make real commitments to first generation and underserved students. So we can build clear, identifiable programs that enable students from communities who have not historically had access to higher education to have access. And that means not just changing our admissions processes, but that's part of it. It also means actively reaching out and creating partnerships with K-12 systems, with youth-serving organizations, with other kinds of community entities that are looking out for youth in communities. And that varies from place to place. Sometimes it's churches, sometimes it's boys and girls clubs, whatever it is. And figuring out how do we work together to ensure that students from communities that have not historically had access do have access, such that students come to college ready for college, that they've had the educational preparation they need, and that we are going to work hand in glove to make sure that happens, right? That's happening at some places. We have terrific examples of this around the country, but it's not happening everywhere, and it creates an enormous opportunity, and it would send a powerful signal to all students, not only students who have the opportunity to take advantage of those processes, but other students, that this matters to the institutions in which they are getting their education. We could work harder to create sustainable campuses, right? Colleges and universities use an enormous amount of energy, they produce an enormous amount of waste. Again, they build buildings, they reshape landscapes, and there are all sorts of ways to do this. You can do it in a way that is socially responsible, you can do it in a way that is thoughtful about the future of the planet. We know that the things we're doing at a planetary level will have disproportionate negative impact on poor communities both in the United States and abroad. So how we act in those realms is a direct reflection of how much we care about that. And again, students are paying attention, so we have choices to make in those areas. Universities could work harder to end campus sexual assault, right? I think we now know the degree to which this is a national crisis. The president has called attention to it. This has been a fact for decades, and institutions have not grappled with it in the ways we need to. There's all kinds of reasons for that, incredibly complicated to actually solve it, to have fair processes that treat all students with respect, but a lot more could be done, and it would send a strong signal about the degree to which we value all of our students across lines of gender, across lines of identity, etc. And we could do a lot more to build substantive partnerships. So we have so many students who we are sending out into communities to do work. And I think sometimes students wonder whether anybody really cares about that at the level of university leadership. And some of this, is driven by my own experience. I would often, when I was at Rutgers Camden, give guest lectures in courses or meet with students who were parts of co-curricular programs, and very often they would ask me, what is the university doing to help make Camden a better place? They were thinking about that question. And that's part of what spurred all of this thinking in me, that we can't just do things for students and expect that that's the end of the story. We need to take action ourselves as leaders of institutions to make change and to do it in ways that are visible to students, and in the best case, that students themselves are part of, right? So if students are engaging with community-based organizations and they know that the president of the institution has a relationship with the people they're connecting with, that many faculty and staff are part of that same work, that is a very different experience from being sent out to go work with a community partner and come back and tell us about it. So faculty and staff. One thing faculty and staff can do is pursue coordinated projects across departments and divisions. In other words, we often do a single thing. We meet some really great person who works for a community-based organization. We design one partnership that involves some students. We do it for a while and then it's over. It's a lot more challenging to reach out to our colleagues and say, how do we work together to build something that's sustainable, that many students can engage in over time, where we can really make change together with partners. It requires working in ways that we don't normally work within the institution. But the opportunities are huge. If your engineering students and your business students and your fine arts students are working together to help community organizations become stronger in ways they do their work and in their facilities and in the kinds of programs maybe they create in the arts or in education or whatever, there are huge opportunities for doing this. And again, there are all sorts of institutional reasons we block ourselves from doing it, but students will see the difference, right? A significant integrated partnership that is making change sends a powerful signal to students about whether the institution at every level cares. So the second part of that is seek community impact. So we shouldn't just be building programs that are focused on student learning. Student learning matters, it has to be part of the story, it's a key feature of what institutions are about, but the students are asking, are we making an impact in the community? And so we have to design programs that actually have that as a goal and engineer them such that students are playing a role in achieving that goal. And then the last thing is engage students in the development and implementation of these projects. They will see the university's commitment if they are at the table with faculty members, staff members, administrators, community partners in building these efforts. If it's behind closed doors, they'll have to discern it. If they're there, involved in the conversation, they will know it. And again, we know that has an impact on their own development. It's also just a powerful learning experience anyway to be part of that work. Okay, and for students, the first thing is you can organize as students for the engaged campus. You can ask of your institution that it live up to its stated values. You can work with fellow students to build support for that. And I think this is often not totally clear to students, but top administrators, they care a lot about what students think. If students are committed to something, if they're organized, if they articulate it, that has more of an impact in my experience than if faculty do it or staff do it or practically anybody else in the institution. The second thing I would say is use established channels to advocate. So at some places I've been at, student governments are mostly focused on things that don't seem very important, and in other places they're focused on key issues that have to do with the identity and commitment of the institution. And if it's that second thing, that can have an impact. So the president of the university probably does care what the leaders of student government think and care about, and if these are the issues that are being foregrounded, that will make a difference. Press for equality and democracy over exclusivity. And what I mean by that is, we all feel good about ourselves if we can say we're at a university that's very exclusive and elite and not everybody gets to be here, and yet we know that that runs contrary to the basic values that we're talking about. So if you are demanding of your institution that it live up to its values, part of that is giving up something in terms of insisting on your own feeling of being in a place of prestige. That's a hard thing to do. But I think at the end of the day, that's a way of showing to the leadership of an institution that you're actually serious about it, that you're willing to say, I would rather be in a place that is known for being accessible to people and open and promoting democratic values, rather than being in a place that's known for keeping most people out. And the last thing is, remember that when you as a student pursue change, you are doing it not for yourself, because you're actually not here for all that long as a student. You're doing it for your successors, right? So be clear about that with yourself, that you are trying to reshape an institution so that it does a better job for the students who come after you of living up to its own values. And again, these things are challenging, but if we have students and faculty and staff who are working in these ways, who are cultivating these values within their own communities, who are beginning to say it matters if we reach out and work together to reshape our institutions, again, university leadership is likely to be responsive to that. Because at the end of the day, it's tough to come to work if everybody wants you to be doing something and you're doing something else, right? It's a lot easier to be in a place where you're moving in the direction that the people who make up the institution really want to go. So, you know, the kind of take-home points are that institutions matter for all kinds of reasons, but part of the reason they matter is because they set examples that shape student experiences and development. And if we care about that, we need to reshape our institutions to live up to the values that all of them promote and that we care about, and that are the framing reasons for this conversation. And so now I have, you know, everything but my home address up there. You can find me in all kinds of ways. And I am wide open to questions or refutations, objections, whatever anybody might bring to the floor.
Yeah, I got a question.
Yeah.
So first and foremost, I just wanted to say thank you. I really enjoyed your conversation, your presentation. But my question to you is, how do you have any practical, steps or pieces of advice from your experience in how to initiate this conversation with these different departments and divisions, particularly when we're thinking about as student affairs professionals being able to reach over to the academic side of the institution and being able to make some meaningful collaborations?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Could everybody hear the question? So, we do work in institutions that have, because for historical reasons and the nature of bureaucracies and whatever, we end up divided with all these lines. And certainly the division between student affairs and academic affairs is one of the craziest and most debilitating that institutions face, right? The first time I encountered the term, like, dean of student life, that was the first, I thought, well, the life of a student, right, has everything to do with their academic experience. So why is it that the dean of student life doesn't talk to folks on the academic side? But it became clear to me that wasn't the case. So I think the first thing I would say is, most things in my experience begin at the level of individual human beings and relationships, right? So some people on the academic side of the house in your institution care about these issues in a holistic way, and they're doing work that reflects that. So the question is, how do you find them, right? And some of the answers are right here. So the folks at Florida Campus Compact in the state of Florida know a lot of the people on every campus who care about this work on the academic side, on the student affairs side, hiding out in other places, in libraries and places where people hide. And They are a resource, and that's true, across the country. If you have an office, whatever the offices are, right? Leadership and social change here at FSU, there we go. They know the people in all kinds of places who care about this work. And on other campuses, there are different offices of service learning, of community engagement, whatever the name is. If you find the people in those places, they can lead you. I know this sounds like a silly thing, but reading like the newsletters that you get filling up your inboxes all the time from all these, if you read those, you learn who's doing what on your campus, and you find potential allies. And then, you do the great American thing, which is you offer to buy them a cup of coffee. And I think really most great things that happen, that's how they start. And so I would say whether it's finding the students and talking to them, which faculty members do you know who are doing great stuff, right? The students know that. And they will say, oh, this person is doing this great stuff and I took this course. Go meet that person. Talk to them and start to say, what do you think? Here are things I could bring you that might help. Here are some resources we have in our office that could contribute to the work you're doing to build it out and make it something stronger. If you're a faculty member doing a project with a community partner, you probably hate the fact that when the semester ends, so does the project. You know that that's not good. But you don't have any tools to change that. You have to go off in the summer and do your research, and you're focused on other things. If somebody said, you know what, we have work study students who could keep that work going over the summer and make that project sustainable, what do you think about that? They might say, wow, I had no idea. Because in general, you guys have probably noticed this, most faculty members don't have any idea what's going on in other realms of the institution, right? Because they're very focused on what they're doing. If you talk to them about the tools you have, you might begin a conversation that could go somewhere. So that's where I would say is the kind of getting started. Yeah?
So I was a little curious. Typically, a lot of institutions nowadays, it's sort of a popular thing to every couple of years go through a strategic planning process. But the difficulty behind that is that you're doing so much work up front that sometimes it's hard to, and frankly, a lot of institutions never end up committing to those things on the strategic plan because there's just so much to do. And then you have the people that are sort of driving that strategic planning process are the ones that are in those privileged positions that don't necessarily understand the need for some of these things. They sort of just get this idea that, oh, if the university can say that it's committed to these things, potentially in its mission statement, then it will just happen, sort of. And so I was curious what you thought about getting the sort of drive to change in the institutional culture to mesh together and to sort of become one.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, the way I think about it is like, where are the points and the moments of leverage, right? Where do you have some opportunities to kind of shake things loose a little bit, turn them in another direction? And certainly processes like strategic planning processes are moments like that because, in my experience, people really do use the plan, and the plan becomes a way to make a good argument for something, right? So the plan doesn't actually make anything happen on its own, but the plan becomes a reason somebody can say, look, we need to dedicate resources to this because we publicly committed to do it. And so there we are. So the plan matters, and whether it's a university-wide strategic plan or for departments or divisions. And what I would say is, so first of all, this is one of the reasons to use the established and legitimate processes within an institution. In most planning processes, people do meet with leaders of student government. And leaders of student government are either going to talk about something unimportant or they're going to talk about something important. And if you have, in advance, gotten directly involved as a student, say, with student government and tried to push it in a direction that reflects these kind of important issues, then when the planning process comes around and student government representatives are there, they're going to be talking about something important. And the same is true of faculty governance structures and whatever. So that's one part of it. The other thing is that all of these processes, again, involve actual people, most of whom do have some degree of commitment to the kinds of values we're talking about, but they may not always be focused on it because they have a million other things. And so finding the ways you can participate. So my title at Rutgers Camden was actually Associate Chancellor for Civic Engagement and Strategic Planning. So I led planning processes as well. And the people who actually showed up to the open meetings or submitted comments through the processes, we took that seriously because you need input to make decisions, and the people who are taking the time and the effort in intelligent, coherent ways to articulate views, you end up thinking like, oh wow, that gives us something to work with. So, I think in most of these cases, it's not that we face kind of opposition. What we face is just a lack of focus on these issues. And so working, through existing channels is often a pretty powerful way to do it. Sometimes, on some issues, there is real opposition. So if you start talking about, responsible investing of the endowment, not everybody's going to agree with that right away. And you're going to have a conversation about it. And it's a very complicated issue because if you manage an endowment, you have to think about its financial sustainability over time, or you'd be irresponsible. So that's a complicated issue. And in cases like that, other forms of organizing might become important. But I think in many cases, figuring out who is in a position to make decisions, so just understanding the institutions you're in, and figuring out the ways to communicate with them, asking whether somebody will meet with you, writing them a well-thought-out email about an issue. I think these things can often be more successful than we would expect in generating serious conversations and serious attention to issues.
Well, tripping over chairs. On behalf of the Dalton Institute, I'd like to give you a commemorative.